topics to cover, but in theory, I could get through all of these in about 20 minutes and have time for a few questions. I guess the first question is, what is human level intelligence? Defining this concept has been a challenge for AI researchers. Some people have suggested that human intelligence may not be a coherent concept, even though we can recognize it when we see it in other people. A Turing test could help recognize human level AI if it's created, but the test doesn't define intelligence and doesn't give us any guidance on how we should achieve human level AI. And also a Turing test focuses on recognizing human identical AI, indistinguishable from humans, but it could be sufficient and important to develop systems that are human-like and understandable, but not human identical. So in 2014, in my thesis, I took a different approach from the Turing test, and I proposed that we define human level intelligence by identifying abilities that are achieved by humans and not yet achieved by any AI system. And the particular abilities I identified, I call higher level mentalities. And they include things like fully general purpose, natural language understanding, self-development, and higher level learning at levels higher than that with sort of previous research on machine learning, metacognition, imagination, artificial consciousness, sociality, visualization, curiosity, creativity, all of these things with the same generality and effectiveness and efficiency that humans achieve. So I give discussions of these topics in my 2019 book and also in the thesis. And today I'll talk just about a few of them a little bit as we go through the slides. Okay, so the next question on my list is, what is knowledge and what is human level knowledge? And dictionaries tend to define knowledge by referring to what's known or to knowing, and that's not very helpful. So I propose the following pragmatic definitions. Knowledge is information that enables intelligence, and human level knowledge is information that enables human level intelligence. So these define knowledge as information, and that's a term that's been studied scientifically in information theory. But these definitions leave open the question of how knowledge is represented and how knowledge enables intelligence. And knowledge can be represented in multiple ways, even in the same system. We might represent some knowledge in the weights of neural networks and other knowledge in symbolic data structures. I use the word enables because knowledge supports the abilities of intelligence. And in addition to knowledge that supports reasoning and answering questions, it can support performing actions or interpreting perceptions. And then human level knowledge is supported and developed by the higher level mentalities of human intelligence. And a key point is that as new knowledge is developed, it may be more valid or more useful than previous knowledge. And eventually previous knowledge could be considered invalid or not useful. So we used to know that the sun orbits the earth, and now we know that the earth orbits the sun. Okay, well, what's the state of research on human level AI and knowledge representation? Well, dramatic progress has been made in recent years with deep neural networks, but we're still very far from achieving human level AI. No AI system can yet replicate the ability to learn and understand natural language that a child demonstrates very normally. And knowledge representation in AI has been a topic ever since the 1970s, but we're still very far from representing the knowledge and systems that we need to achieve human level AI. We're still very far from creating an AI system that could, in principle, understand all the knowledge that people have documented in Wikipedia, or understand all the common sense knowledge that people use all the time. Okay, so what are the major options to achieve human level AI and human level knowledge representation? And there are logically three major alternatives. We could have purely symbolic approaches, We could have neural network architectures, or we could create hybrid systems. And arguably, in theory, either the symbolic or the neural network approaches could each be successful on their own based on computational generality. But hybrid approaches could have the advantage that the two different directions, symbolic and neural networks, could augment each other. And so I propose a class of hybrid architectures that I call a TalaMind architecture. Okay, and I'll talk a bit more about the TalaMind architecture later in this presentation. But the next question on my list is, what are the major options for natural language understanding? And the options basically parallel those for achieving human level AI. Again, we can have purely symbolic or neural network or hybrid systems. And we could have the same arguments again, that any of these directions in theory could be successful, but the hybrid approaches have some potential strong points. But if we focus just on the symbolic processing methods, because we're mainly using a hybrid approach, there are two different alternatives to consider. The first is to treat natural language as external data and to translate natural language to and from some simpler internal symbolic language, like predicate calculus or conceptual graphs or even n-tuples, and then to perform all of the reasoning and processing within the AI system on that simpler internal symbolic representation. And this has been the traditional approach for natural language understanding for several decades. But there's another approach, and that is to use natural language as a language of thought within an AI system. And so what does that mean? It means that we would represent internally within an AI system the syntax and semantics of natural language expressions, and that our inference and conceptual processing would be performed with these natural language data structures. And we could have other symbolic languages that support this, like support pattern matching or whatever. But in this approach, the data structures that represent natural language expressions are the general high-level representations of thoughts within the AI system. Now, there's not a scientific consensus that this approach cannot work. It's just been an assumption for decades that AI systems should only use formal logic languages or simpler symbolic languages for internal representation. But there does not appear to be any valid theoretical reason why a natural language like English could not be used directly by an AI system for its language of thought. And so this is discussed at length in my 2014 thesis and the 2019 book. And again, this approach could be combined with neural networks in a hybrid approach. Okay, so what previous research has been done about or toward directly toward a natural language of thought? In 1955, John McCarthy proposed to create a computer language that would have properties similar to English for his research on the Dartmouth Summer Research Project. And his artificial language would allow a computer to solve problems, make conjectures, and refer to itself. And he said that concise English sentences would have equivalent concise sentences in the formal language. So at least at the very beginning of work on AI, he proposed this concept, at least in some respects. But it's not clear what research he actually did from 55 to 59 regarding this. By 1959, his papers focused on predicate logic within AI systems. And in 2008, he published a paper arguing that a natural language like English would not work as a language of thought. And that's discussed in my 2019 book in some detail, and also in my 2014 thesis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. In 1979, Noah Hart wrote a senior thesis on the use of natural language syntax to support inference in AI systems. His thesis was unpublished and it's unavailable. I recall it was about 20 pages. And I discussed that in the preface of my 2014 thesis and also the 2019 book. My thesis advocated developing AI systems using an internal language that I call Tala, and it's based on the unconstrained syntax of English. And the thesis proposed a hybrid architecture that I call TalaMind for systems to achieve human-level AI. And that would include an associative level for neural networks. And I gave a prototype demonstration at the linguistic level. And this diagram illustrates the architecture of the TalaMind system. There are three levels, main levels: a linguistic level where a natural language of thought is used for representation of concepts and ideas and for processing at that level. An archetype level where cognitive categories are represented, and I considered a variety of different approaches and discussed those. And then a third level, an associative level where connectionism and Bayesian processing are used or available. And again, we could have neural networks at that level. And in fact, in theory, you could use neural networks at higher levels too, if in principle. It's not necessarily confined to that lower level. But all of these features, I think, are important for achieving human-level AI. And especially important is the language of thought that can support unconstrained syntax and semantics of English, and representing and reasoning directly with the syntax and semantics. And for precision, I call a system that has this architecture a Tala agent. Okay, so what previous research has been done related to just the topic of an AI natural language of thought? Afzal Balam and Yorick Wilkes wrote in 1991 about this concept. And they were in favor of humans using languages of thought and in favor of AI systems using those kinds of languages. But the research that they actually did at that point in time focused on more some limited symbolic languages and formal logics. There's also been a lot of research on natural logic that has studied how natural language syntax can support logically valid reasoning. Kartunen gave an overview of this research in 2015 and traced the idea back to Aristotle. And the TalaMind approach could be considered as a kind of natural logic because it involves using natural language syntax for reasoning. And in a 2021 paper, the one that this presentation is based on, I discussed how the TalaMind approach addresses the issues that Kartunen identified. In particular, it's not required that a Tala phrase have a single interpretation in all usages. Okay, well, what arguments have been given against, or rather for an AI natural language of thought, even if people didn't do research on this specifically? Moravcsik gave reasons why natural language is not a formal logic language. And the arguments that he gave imply obstacles for using formal logic to represent the knowledge that we normally express in natural language. And so I discussed that at length in a 2019 paper. And Moravcsik acknowledged our ability to reason deductively within natural language. So in principle, the body of his work comprises an argument for this concept. My own analysis in my 2014 thesis and also went over all the issues as well as I could cover them, discussing how this could support achieving human level AI and be valid. And Tala provides a language for reasoning with under-specification and sentences that have meaning, but could also have nonsensical interpretations. Okay, arguments against an AI natural language of thought. There have been several arguments that I've encountered directly or indirectly against the idea. Again, as I noted earlier, McCarthy in 2008 wrote a paper, and he gave arguments that English would not work as a language of thought for AI systems that have human level intelligence. he said it would be appropriate for a robot to use logic for its language of thought. So I discuss his arguments in detail in my 2019 book. And basically, he relied on an assumption that the characteristics of public spoken or written natural language would automatically obtain for AI systems that use natural language as a language of thought. And so I discuss in my paper why that's, in my book rather, in detail, why that's not a valid conclusion. Kilgariff, the lexicographer Adam Kilgariff, published a paper in 1997 entitled "I Don't Believe in Word Senses," which is sort of an ironic thing for a lexicographer to say. And he quoted another very noted lexicographer who also said that. His paper might be used to argue against the viability of an AI natural language of thought. So in a 2019 paper, I analyzed Kilgariff's paper. My paper was called "I Do Believe in Word Senses." And I found room to take exception on several points. And I discussed how word senses can exist and be shared intersubjectively in human minds and also in human level AI. There's also an argument I've encountered that what we say is only the tip of the iceberg, and therefore we can't use natural language in an AI system as its language of thought. I agree that humans use natural language intentionally, that what we say is often only the tip of the iceberg, but that does not theoretically preclude an AI system from using natural language as its internal language of thought. And there's an argument that humans do not use a language of thought, and therefore, why should we try to attempt that with a human level AI? And on the other hand, there is substantial research that suggests that humans may use a natural language or use a language of thought of some kind. And that research is also briefly cited in my 2021 paper. In any case, the TalaMind approach doesn't advocate or depend upon arguments about what humans do in their own minds. And finally, there's a general class of arguments against a natural language of thought that ambiguity is a theoretical barrier. But I would say, in contrast, ambiguity has a major benefit. It lets us communicate about anything without having to be specific about everything. And Wilson and Sperber discussed how pragmatic reasoning, according to relevance theory, can support disambiguation. And in principle, I've argued that this can also be supported by an AI system. So I don't believe there's a valid theoretical reason why ambiguity is a barrier. Rather, there's a synergy in using natural language to support disambiguation, and there are reasons why supportive ambiguity is a virtue of natural language of thought. And it's also the case that formal logic is inherently ambiguous. Any formal logic theory has undefined terms that are ambiguous outside the theory. We interpret these terms, or may interpret them as having meanings, but the meanings depend on our own understanding that's generally achieved via natural language. And using natural language, we can name and describe events and things we don't know how to fully define or explain with formal theories. Okay, so how has TalaMind been demonstrated? I did create a functional prototype in which two Tala agents interact in an environment that's simulated with symbolic expressions. It's a very limited demonstration that illustrates two stories, one in which they discover how to make bread, and another in which they agree on an exchange of wheat for bread. The simulation is displayed as a sequence of English sentences for their interactions, and also for their actions and percepts and their thoughts in the simulation. Each of them has its own prototype conceptual framework and conceptual processes. And to a very preliminary extent, the simulation illustrates learning and discovery by reasoning analogically, causal and purposive reasoning, meta reasoning, imagination, and internal dialogue in a society of mind. However, what happens at each step depends on the initial goals and executable concepts that they have within their conceptual frameworks. So the simulations are predefined, even though the conceptual processing involves creation of goals. What future work is needed to develop TalaMind? There's a lot more work that needs to be done. This is a very high-level list of the many things that need to be done. And a longer list is given in my 2019 book. Many challenges remain. Is there an existence proof that this approach could work? I would argue that human intelligence is the existence proof. We know that human intelligence is based on processing of complex neural networks in the brain. We know that humans use natural language to communicate thoughts, knowledge, reasoning, and that humans engage in self-talk. There appears to be no evidence that human intelligence is based on formal logic. Formal logic is an abstract language we invented based on our natural languages. So there's reason to think that we should focus on developing a natural language of thought to achieve human level AI. And that concludes my talk. I'd be glad to try to answer a few questions.
Any questions?
Yeah, I have one. This is Sam Adams. So how do you deal with the dictionary problem of natural language, that to define any word, you have to have a dozen other words? Where does it bottom out in your model?
Well, there have to be some primitive words, let's put it that way, that are contained in the intelligence kernel that the system starts with and begins, sort of takes as givens. And these may be grounded to some extent in how the system works with its associative level and what it can perceive from the environment. Mm-hmm. But there would have to be some initial words that are built into the system that the thing starts with. That's the challenge of building an intelligence kernel.
Do you have a base dictionary of those kinds of words that in your papers or your book?
I give some discussion of that topic, and I would say that if you started with the sort of 100 words that are sort of the simplest words that everybody knows, or that 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds learn, that's a good starting point. That's about as well as I can answer the question at this point.
There's actually something called Basic English that is supposed to be just such a core that people have decided upon, that theoretically you can build any other meaning using simple only basic English. So that might be worth looking into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I got a question someone sent me for you. Let me read it here. Does TalaMind have the capability to think in sounds and images, or can it be expanded to include those?
I would say well, the prototype, of course, doesn't do that. The prototype is entirely symbolic processing. But a full-scale system should be able to do visual processing, imagination, think in images in that respect, and associate sounds with the words that it knows in English and so on. And it would also engage in self-talk, and that wouldn't necessarily have to relate to hearing sounds, but it could.
So maybe you touched on this and I missed it, but how do you address the symbol grounding problem?
Well, I think I sort of answered that in the previous question, in the sense that if we go back to the architecture, okay, right. You've got symbols that are being used at the linguistic level and also at the archetype level. And all of those things are ultimately grounded in in interactions in the environment via information that flows up from the associative level and so on. And again, if you have the intelligence kernel would ground some initial set of symbols relative to perceptions at the associative level in the environment.
Okay. Good. So does anyone else have any other questions? Oh, someone asked, what is the radial category in the middle section? Zach, I'm not sure what slide you're talking about.
Okay, if we're looking at this
Radial
slide here,
category,
I'm just,
here it is. Yeah.
yeah, at the archetype level, and in my thesis in 2019 book, I discussed a variety of different formalisms for representing cognitive categories that people in natural computational linguistics and AI and so on have developed over the years. Radial categories is one of them. Image schemas, conceptual domains, so on. And I'd have to look up again what a good definition of that is. I think it's basically the idea that categories are sort of connected to each other radially, and that you can have something that is, well, you can have a cat, and there are different variations of cat, and at some extent you modify things, and at some point it's no longer a cat, it's a totally different animal, that kind of idea. But I came at all of this and did all of this study looking at varieties of different ways of representing cognitive categories. And one thing I did not include, which I'll talk about in the talk tomorrow, is qualitative processes and qualitative representations. But those are also very important, belong at this level.
Great. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Phil. That was great.
Thank you.